Good morning. I'm Glenn Lowry, Director of the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation about Bruce Conner. It's all true. It really is. This exhibition was made possible by Hyundai Card, and we are deeply grateful to Hyundai Card for their ongoing support for so many projects and exhibitions here, and we welcome their representatives from Korea who have joined us this morning. Funding for this project was also provided by Jill and Peter Krause through their Endowed Fund for Contemporary Exhibitions, the Walton Family Foundation, and the Museum of Modern Art's Annual Exhibition Fund. I'm particularly happy that our colleagues from SF MoMA are here with us. Rudolf Freeling, Curator of Media Arts and co-curator of this project. Gary Garrels, who comes here as a beloved former Chief Curator of Drawings and a curator on this project as well. And Rachel Federman, who was on the staff of SF MoMA and working on this project when it began. And of course, here at the Museum of Modern Art, Laura Hauptmann and Stuart Comer. They were the team that put this absolutely riveting exhibition together. I also want to say how thrilled we are that Jean Conner is with us. I know she started her day yesterday at a brutally early hour in the morning in order to be here. So Jean, thank you so much for making the effort and for being here, and I hope you are as pleased with this exhibition as we are. This project really is a collaboration with SF MoMA, and it was really SF MoMA's driving impulse that put this exhibition into play, and I'm thrilled that Neil Benezra, Director of SF MoMA, is with us. And Neil, I wonder if you would say a few words. And as he comes to the podium, let me just take this opportunity to say congratulations in a very public way to the absolutely brilliant job you and your colleagues did in building the new SF MoMA.
Thank you, Glenn, very, very much. SF MoMA and the Museum of Modern Art have collaborated on many occasions through the course of our respective tenures, and Bruce Conner, it's all true, is only the most recent of these. And I did a little research, and I found this really stellar list of exhibitions that we've worked on in one configuration or another together. Gerhard Richter, Andreas Gursky, Bryce Martin, Olafur Eliasson, Jeff Wall, Lee Friedlander, Martin Purrier, William Kentridge, and Cindy Sherman, just in the last, 10 or 12 years or so. So that's pretty extraordinary. Glenn, I really do want to thank you as well for your partnership and friendship. Glenn has been a wonderful, not just colleague, but friend and counselor to me as we've gone through our expansion. So I'm totally grateful to you for that. Bruce Conner was thought for many, many years to be I suppose a central figure in the kind of counterculture of the San Francisco Bay Area. That was the extent of his reputation to a very considerable extent. And now I think it's safe to say that he's increasingly been recognized as one of the most influential artists of our time. To have this retrospective, which is the first since his death, presented here in New York and premiering here in New York, I must say, and at the Museum of Modern Art, only testifies to the expanding reputation and awareness that is bound to follow this exhibition, and when it comes, of course, to San Francisco. Glenn mentioned Jean Conner, who is herself a very fine artist in her own right. Thank you, Jean, for your cooperation and that of Robert Conway and Michelle Silva and the Conner Family Trust. You've been indispensable partners in this project. It could not have been accomplished without you. And Glenn mentioned the curators, Rudolph, Gary, Stuart Comer, Laura Hauptmann here in San Francisco, here in New York, and also Rachel Federman, who was a former assistant curator of painting and sculpture at our museum and was a central figure in the development of the project. Before I pass the word back to Glenn, I just want to also acknowledge the support that we received from the Henry Luce Foundation, which was very, very important in the organization of the project, and so we're very grateful to Luce. So, Glenn, with pride, I'll pass the word back to you.
So I wonder if Laura and Stuart would join me. We'll have a brief conversation to introduce the exhibition to all of you and then open it up to questions. Thank you, Neil, for those very generous words. So this is a large, sprawling, complicated, rich exhibition. And since Bruce Conner, as Neil suggested, is not necessarily a household name, at least here on the East Coast, who is Bruce Conner?
I only met him once. I shook his hand in 2000. I wish I knew him as a person, but as an artist, I think he's the best known, least known artist in American post-war art. And that he is an artist who inhabited many different areas of the visual arts discourse, primarily film, cinema, but also primarily, and especially at the beginning of his career, the burgeoning genre of assemblage. And it's during our research, something that was very interesting that I came upon was that when Conner first showed in New York, he showed as a very young man. He was 23 years old when he had his first exhibition here. And up until around 1965, when he stopped making his assemblages, he was a key member of a movement of assembleurs who included Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. And in fact, over and over, he was mentioned in that particular cohort. And when he chose to remove himself and work on something else, he did this deliberately, and he chose to leave that milieu.
It's All True comes actually from Bruce himself. And I think it's kind of like this fabulous little window into his thinking. You want to talk a little bit about the letter and how it sets up this exhibition, Stuart?
I think it's clear, if you've seen the exhibition, the degree to which Bruce was a shapeshifter, and he never settled into one mode of making for any period of time. And when this letter was written, he effectively compiled a long list of very contradictory adjectives that had been used to describe his work in the press, and then Riley said, "It's all true." And he really was elusive. I think the work itself can be very fugitive. He championed the fact that his work would change over time, and he was true to his interest in cutting and pasting and reassembling things, constantly changing the nature of his own identity as well as the work itself. So this fact that it was so difficult to pin him down, and now that this is the first major posthumous retrospective, it really is an important chance for us all to start to pick through these secrets that have circulated for a long time about the work, but hopefully without fixing him too much. I think it would be a disservice if we tried to over-define the work. So I hope that this exhibition creates signposts for understanding how important this career was, hugely important, but without fixing it too much.
And just to add, I'm sorry, and also to create connections, which is a challenge with such a various body of work.
One of the works, certainly in our collection, that I'm so pleased is in this exhibition is Child, an early assemblage piece, and the result of a rather monumental conservation research project. Laura or Stuart, do you want to talk about what was involved in a sense, bringing that work back to life?
I'll just do a general contextual comment about conservation in general, and maybe Laura can dive into the details about our brilliant colleagues in our conservation department who did restore Child after a long and troubled history. I think Bruce's work in general is marked by a high degree of fragility, from the assemblages to celluloid itself, which, as we all know, is in a precarious state right now. Film in general, as we know, is shifting radically. So in taking on this exhibition, it was critical to start looking at both the objects, the films, and other materials in which he worked, and really assess how to preserve them for posterity, and to really take some risks in a way to do things maybe that had not been done before. And so I wanted to shout out Roger Griffiths and Megan in our conservation team, and Michelle Silva at the Conner Family Trust, who've done heroic work to make some of this work look its very, very best for this exhibition.
And Child is MoMA has a long and illustrious history with Bruce Conner, beginning in the mid-1950s when one of our curators, Dorothy Miller, went to visit him in Wichita, Kansas, and returned to start a file on him and write a note that said, talented artist to watch, or something of that sort. And when Child was created finished in 1960, the Museum of Modern Art made an attempt to acquire this strange and wonderful work. It's made of wax, and it is an homage to Carol Chessman, a thief and a rapist, but not a murderer, who was executed by the state of California to the dismay of many of the anti-capital punishment people. Bruce is one of them. And the Child wasn't acquired in 1960, but eventually it came to us as a gift a decade later. And by that time, it had deteriorated greatly. And over the years, it deteriorated to a point where it was completely unshowable. Connor came to visit Child several times, and we were in correspondence for more than a decade about how to work on this. And our colleagues took this on last year as a project that I guess was also an inquiry, because they weren't sure whether this was going to be possible, since there had been failure after failure over so many years. And you can see it today in this exhibition. It is 99.9% of the original material. I'm looking at my colleagues here, there's just an interior armature and then one small piece of stocking across the mouth that is a new, and it really is a testament to our conservators, but also to the history and the staying power of our commitment to Bruce Conner that started 50 years ago.
Neil mentioned counterculture, and certainly that's a theme that runs pretty much through Bruce's work. Stuart, do you want to talk about the films in particular and how they intersect with both the countercultural movement and perhaps even with cinematic history today?
Sure. I mean, I think even if you take two of the earliest films in the show, A Movie, which opens the exhibition, and Looking for Mushrooms, which marks a period in which Bruce and Jean Conner moved to Mexico and were actively exploring psychedelic mushrooms with Timothy Leary and really engaging in this an expanded idea of the trip, of trips of all kinds, and really exploring a countercultural view of the world. I think it's interesting too, just since this is the first retrospective in New York, and the extent to which certain West Coast movements, I think, were never fully accommodated in some of the narratives being written in this city. And it's becoming more and more clear that the counterculture itself produced, fundamentally important projects, and I think cinema and experimental cinema in particular was a major part of that. So by the time you move from all of these scenes of death and destruction that are sort of cut up and reordered in a movie, and Bruce's reflection on very American symptoms of a very kind of dark period during the atomic age, and then the escape from that in Mexico, and his sort of delight in finding an intense spirituality in every corner of the streetscape in Mexico City. How that then relates to the final film that he completed, Easter Morning, in 2006, which is the final work in the exhibition as well, which is really a counterpoint to the darkness, the sort of apocalyptic vision that marks so much of the early work, and in particular the early films. And again, I think he was constantly re-editing and reworking his own films. There are many films that were not completed. He made over 20 films. And I think we've tried to select the 7 films in the exhibition that really highlight key strategies or key moments in the work, but also films that really relate to his other practices, whether it be in drawing, assemblage making, printmaking. They were each distinct bodies of work in some ways, but there's an intense fluidity that I think really does indicate a strong vision and a strong reaction to many cultural and countercultural developments of the time.
Yeah, I was always struck by the drawings. They have, if the films have a certain kind of fluidity and shape-shifting dimension to them, the drawings have this incredibly intense, almost obsessive dimension to them. And you want to talk a little bit about his drawings as a whole?
Well, Conner worked in drawing from the beginning of his career to the end of his career in various ways. He worked with ink, he worked with the new technology of magic marker, which is something that somebody should do a show on someday, because Yayoi Kusama and many other artists of the time were working with this, and it changed their drawing. Conner worked with with collage. We can specific paper collage from the beginning of his career to the very end. And he also pioneered this technique of manipulating ink blots to a fantastic effect, starting in the 1970s, and again continuing until the end of his career. And I think that these bodies of work are on their own, islands on their own, but they also relate to his filmic work as well as his assemblages, because of the concentration it takes not just to make them, but to look at them as well. I think for Bruce Conner, there is always the acknowledgement of the viewer in everything that he has done, and especially in the drawings, you can not only admire the steadiness of hand and this almost superhuman concentration or attention to detail, but it also is on us to be able to look so carefully and closely as possible in order to divine really the meaning and also the intensity of the work. It's a similar thing with the assemblages. You need to put despite the pieces of plastic on many of them, I encourage you to put your nose up very close to them and look at all the details. And this is part also of a kind of incantatory, metaphysical and spiritual the nature of a lot of the work, and it has to do with the way that the works on paper are made, not just what they are, but how they're made on his part, and also how we receive them and how we look at them.
I want to come back to the contradictoriness of It's All True. I can't think of another artist who so embraced the idea of these polarities. You read down that list, and it's just about every possible condition and its opposite. And he leaves us in a kind of quandary, right, about what to believe, where on the spectrum of any one of his contradictions he fits. And it seems to me that embrace of contradictoriness is one of the most important themes that runs both through his practice, through the exhibition, and what this work means for us today. And
I mean, I think the one thing I think no one could deny is that, this work has unbelievable energy. And I mean, going back to the idea of the counterculture, different countercultures had different energies. And so I think it's very telling to see the punk material next to the inkblot drawings, for instance. One is marked by an extreme degree of aggression and violence. The other is very spiritual, very ethereal. And he threw himself into both of those situations with a great vigor. And so I think just the way that, he just approached everything he did with such passion, such perfectionism, an incredible work ethic. And, I think each of these things sort of stands on their own term, and often they do contradict each other. And I think the other thing that, Bruce, I met him twice, and certainly the second time I met him, we were discussing film and video, and he was adamant that he would never, ever, ever show his work on video. And that, of course, changed fundamentally, and you see that in the wonderful installation Three Screen Ray. And his first film, a movie, which again opens the show, he'd originally conceived this as an installation in the 1950s, which is hard to imagine, but it would have been rear screen projected with other objects and elements in the room. So finally, in the early 2000s, he finally achieves this idea of, and actually even before he'd experimented with three-screen projection. But if you think about the minute detail in the drawings, or the sort of macro and micro spatial configurations that go on in the assemblages, and then you're suddenly immersed in this cinematic, immersive space. And I think even spatially he contradicted himself. And he would go very deep into tiny, minute details, but then he really understood space, I think. And that's, in speaking to Michel Silva, it became very clear that there was a kind of golden mean that he had for sketching out the ideal proportions for a video or a film installation. So I think he was very aware of how people encountered his work, and so even if it was contradictory, I just think there was an unbelievable degree of focus and dedication in the work that maybe unites all of the different things that might depart from one another. But also the role play, I think, and there's one section of the exhibition where you'll see his campaign for supervisor, for instance, or many strategies he used to get away from being, Bruce Conner, or would really play with different pseudonyms. He did not want to be easily absorbed into the art market or into any official histories. He really was a contrarian and came up with a lot of different strategies to put that into play.
Let me turn this over to all of you to ask any questions that you might have, if you do have any. Yes, Lee, thank goodness.
Keying off of what you just said about not being readily absorbed and the fact that he was a shapeshifter, was he influential, or did that kind of elusiveness almost preclude that? Was he influential on other artists and movements?
One artist I can think of who contributed, several artists contributed to the catalog. Dara Birnbaum in particular, just as one example, who, when I mentioned Bruce to her, she just got so excited. She said he was so influential on me, and just, if you can see it in her work, just this notion of appropriating media imagery and what that meant to her. Certainly he had a major influence, but what you're also seeing now, I think, is a generation of younger artists. There's an exhibition now at the Whitney called Mirror Cells, which is, I would imagine largely artists work in their 20s and 30s, and I wouldn't claim at all that they necessarily knew Bruce's work, but there's no question that there's a strong resonance between them. And I think a lot of people are looking at the way younger artists in particular are not necessarily adopting digital strategies, but are returning to the object, or this idea of the handmade, ready-made assemblage object. And there's also a very strong Gothic sensibility that you see chiming with the black wax works, if you look at a young artist like Stuart Uo. So I think there's a very strong relationship between many generations of artists and Bruce's work.
And I also wanted to add about his use of assemblage, which came early and on time, and during the period of time where it was reigning in the discourse in New York particularly. He was an innovator in that, in assemblage. And of course, slightly later, the advent of assemblage in Southern and Northern California, he was at the very center of that moment, beginning from his first encounters with his fellow Northern Californian assemblers in 1958, all the way until the mid-1960s when he stopped making assemblage. So he's a titan on both coasts in terms of the history of art in that way, and definitely in terms of contemporary art, this way of working digitally and by hand at the same time, or working filmically and by hand at the same time, is something that's a regular part of the discussion in contemporary art, in 21st century art right now.
I think something that I really hope this exhibition will generate here in New York in particular is a fundamental reassessment of how we think about California, because this museum has done very few major retrospectives of California artists, and I think the last one would have been Mike Kelly at MoMA PS1, and for me there are really important connections between Mike Kelly's work and Bruce's work. They were both polymaths, the way they engaged, again, with countercultural activities and shape-shifting. I think there's a strong connection between the two of them as well. But I think we have to find other approaches, other narratives, other frameworks to position Bruce's work in, both within the California context and rethinking a more international context for the work.
I agree, because he can't so easily just be inserted into the story that we're already telling. He has his own story. He's almost his own planet, his own group of constellations, however you want to put it. But I think that makes him exceptional in so many different ways. And whatever one sees as new material, it has to be first and foremost dealt with on its own terms and then assimilated into what we already know, as it were.
Thank you, Lee. Other questions?
I have more of a comment than a question, but it seemed, following up on your idea of California and art, that Bruce was not so much part of the art market, and because the art market was far away in California, although there was certainly in the 60s business, not like the business model that existed in New York, where you were turning out paintings and sculptures and paintings and sculptures, and pop artists who made brightly colored things, and that was not Bruce. And I think that allowed him to explore so many different things without being beholden to that market. And so the contrariness of his personality and his career certainly influenced the types of works he made, and which has made it very difficult for, let's say, the casual art viewer to absorb all of the variety of media that he worked in, plus the interiority of the work. It is so intense that you don't get everything as you walk by. You can't view his show from the window. You have to actually look at it. And so it has made it, I think, difficult for art history in general to embrace until now.
And can you introduce yourself? This is Michael Cohen, who has worked with Bruce Conner as his representative in Los Angeles since 1989, so you certainly know from whence you speak.
Yeah, I think, the aspect that you were touching on, for me, is the obverse or the reverse to the contradictoriness, which is the resistance, right? I think Bruce is an artist who really understands the power of resistance, and that resistance is both a very palpable physical resistance that you feel as you're working your way through the exhibition, as well as a larger kind of metaphysical resistance to the market, to being understood and accepted in a single way. And I think that those two qualities are very much of today. There's always an interesting question about reception. When is the right moment to really reconsider or even consider an artist? And I just think Bruce's work today feels extremely fresh and of the moment, precisely because he understood the power of resistance and the need for resistance at a time when, culture can seem all-consuming.
But it's interesting. I mean, Michael in particular first presented Three Screen Ray at Art Basel, and I think it was that presentation that led a lot of people in the art world to really wake up to the importance of the work. And that dovetailed with a moment where experimental film in particular was beginning to enter the marketplace for the first time. So if you look at that side of Bruce's work in particular, there's really a lot to learn and to think about. And even with a movie very early on, he was obsessed with this idea of collectors in particular, treating his films almost like Chinese scrolls that they would pull out and watch over and over and over again. And again, this very personal connection that you mentioned. But he was thinking about modes of viewership that I think were not at all central to the way the conventional logic of the art world worked. And so it's part of the challenge now of to what extent do we accommodate him in those logics, and to what extent do we keep him free of it?
Other questions or comments? If not, what I'd like to do is again thank our colleagues from San Francisco for having co-curated this exhibition, to Neil for having provided the leadership that has guided San Francisco to such a wonderful place today, to our friends from Hyundai Card for being with us, to the Bruce Conner Trust, and to Jean in particular for sharing this moment with us. And we'll be around if you want to ask questions or go back upstairs and look at the exhibition. Thank you, Laura and Stuart.
Thank you.